That rotten bridge is an eyesore to this neighborhood. Tear it down now." Claudia Harrow, the HOA president in a white suit, sneered as she watched my family's keepsake get leveled. But she forgot the dam belonged to me, and when the gate opened and the lake drained, their $4 million resort lay bare in the mud. Justice doesn't always come through paperwork. Sometimes it comes with the roar of water. What state are you in? And has your HOA ever dared to pull something this outrageous? The wooden bridge across the lake wasn't anything grand or impressive. In fact, at a glance, most people probably wouldn't even bother to notice it. It was old, simple, with sun-bleached planks, some rotting from years of rain and moss. But to me, that bridge was more than just a few pieces of wood nailed together. It was like an invisible thread holding together what was left of my family, anchoring the scattered fragments of memory, slowly fading with time. When we first moved to this neighborhood, I took my daughter out to the lake, holding the same old fishing rod I'd since I was young. I showed her how to bait the hook so the fish wouldn't suspect a thing, how to lower the float gently so it wouldn't disturb the water, and most importantly, how to be patient, something kids rarely have. My wife was still healthy then, her silver hair tied neatly behind her neck, often sitting at the edge of the bridge, quietly watching the sun dip behind the trees, her face peaceful as if time itself couldn't touch her. The sunset didn't just redden the lake, it lit up her smile, glowing like part of the earth and sky. That wasn't a long chapter in our lives, but it etched itself deep into my mind like a still painting filled with life. Since the day she passed, the bridge became the only place where my daughter and I could find a trace of peace. Even though it leaned to one side, even though we had to step carefully to avoid slipping, we went out there every weekend. I brought the bait box, and my daughter brought a photo of her mother. She said it was so mom could go fishing with us too. We didn't say much, just sat quietly next to each other, listening to the breeze, the gentle lapping of water, and the sound of time passing second by second. The bridge wasn't just a place. It was a living memory, a space where I tried to give my daughter the feeling that family still existed in some form, fragile, but not gone. That morning, the sky was crystal clear, as if rinsed clean after a night of light rain. A soft breeze carried the damp scent of grass and water. The lake was flat as glass, mirroring the endless sky above. My daughter and I brought out our rod, feeling as calm as we always did. I remember exactly how it felt when I clicked open the bait box, and suddenly the roar of an engine echoed down from the hill, loud, harsh, completely out of place in that full space. A large truck appeared, followed by a crowd of people in orange safety vests, hard hats, tool belts strapped to their back. They swarmed down like an organized unit, like it had all been carefully planned. In a matter of seconds, the atmosphere around the lake changed, entirely chaotic, unfamiliar, tight like a string pulled to its breaking point. I didn't even have time to process what was happening when a woman stepped out from the crowd. She stood out not just because of how sharply dressed she was, a light-colored suit without a single wrinkle, heels clicking with precision, but because of the sheer presence she commanded in the way she stood, spoke, and looked around. Her blonde hair was tied up neatly, chin tilted slightly upward, eyes sweeping across the area like she was inspecting her personal property. Every gesture she made carried an air of certainty, cold enough to make others feel small. Her name was Claudia Harrow, a name I had never heard at the time, but one I would never forget. Her voice rang out, clear and unapologetically scornful. "Tear it down. This ugly thing is an eyesore to the entire neighborhood. I don't want to see it for one more day." The moment the words left her mouth, the workers sprang into action. One grabbed a chainsaw, another hoisted a sledgehammer, as if they had been waiting for this moment. I was still frozen, unable to react, when the first planks were ripped from the bridge. The chainsaw roared, wood cracked and splintered, peaceful air that had just embraced us torn apart by the chaos. Boards flew, sawdust swirled into the clanging of metal, a soundtrack to destruction. In just a few short minutes, the familiar bridge had become a wreck of shattered wood. My daughter panicked. She trembled, clutching my arm tightly, tears streaming down like a broken dam. She cried out, her voice breaking, "Daddy, why are they doing this?" I held her close, feeling her small body shake with each sob. I wanted to answer, to say something comforting, to explain, but my throat was locked. The surge of emotion hit like a wave, swelling, crashing, choking off every word. Claudia stood there, arms crossed, her gaze drifting past me and my daughter, as if we were nothing but faint shadows. She curled her lip into a cold smirk and said, "This is Lakeshore Estates, not some cheap public park. That cheap bridge didn't belong here." I stood in silence, every word struck like a cold blade to the chest. I looked at the floating planks, remembering every afternoon, every moment, every time my wife had sat there. What we had lost couldn't be recovered, and now, it had been erased completely by a stranger, simply because she found it unpleasant to look at. No questions, no notice, not even the smallest gesture of respect. I felt the blood rush to my face, my hand clenched so tight it turned pale, but I didn't shout, didn't charge forward, didn't cry. Instead, something quieter but stronger ignited inside me like fire burning beneath the ash. In my eyes, Claudia was no longer just a person. She was a symbol of arrogance, of that cold authority that believes money can crush anything, even memory, love, and dignity. My daughter was still crying, her sobs cutting into me like knives. I knelt down, placed a hand on her shoulder, and whispered in a low, hoarse voice, "We'll remember this bridge, and we won't forget what they did." I said nothing else, but in my mind, a vow had formed, not petty vengeance, a promise to never bow to cruelty. We left the lake in silence. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The bridge was gone, but what it stood for could not be erased. In my memory, Claudia standing atop the ruins, her eyes cold as stone, is an image I'll carry always, not out of hatred, but as a reminder that if left unchecked, will go on to destroy the smallest, beautiful things we have left. And I knew clearly, the day would come when Claudia would pay the price for her arrogance. And I knew clearly, the day would come when Claudia would pay the price for her arrogance. The next morning, just as I stepped outside with my daughter to take her to school, my eyes landed on the announcement board planted boldly at the entrance of the neighborhood. The bolded text was dry, condescending, and hit like a slap. Mr. Nathaniel Gray has committed a serious violation by constructing an unauthorized bridge, negatively affecting the aesthetic of the community. The notice was neatly framed, sealed with the HOA's stamp, as if it were a ruling from a court of law. My family's bridge was now paraded before hundreds of residents, turned into so-called evidence of a violation. I stood silently in front of the board, feeling both humiliated and furious. Those few lines weren't just a personal insult, they were Claudia's way of announcing to the entire neighborhood that she had the power to decide, the power to turn anyone into a criminal. I heard whispers from passers-by. A man walking his dog glanced over and quickly tugged the animal in the other direction. A woman carrying a fruit basket turned her face away, but still managed to whisper to her friend, "I heard he built that bridge illegally. Someone like that doesn't belong in Lakeshore Estate." Every word felt like a needle piercing my back. I could feel the discrimination showing in their eye. They didn't say it outright, but I knew what they meant. I was the only person of color living near the lake, and unlike most people here, I didn't flaunt wealth. To them, my presence was a disruption, and all Claudia had to do was point, and the community was ready to look away. That afternoon, as I passed by the HOA office, I paused for a moment. Through the glass door, I saw Claudia sitting in her swivel chair, lifting a steaming latte to her lips, wearing a smirk. Her voice rang out, just loud enough for anyone outside to hear. "Some people just don't understand what elegance means. They bring their cheap habits here, and think they can fit in." Her assistant giggled, nodding in agreement. I clenched my nails digging into my skin. The feeling of being mocked in broad daylight choked me with rage, and for a moment, I wanted to storm in and slam my fist on her desk, but I stopped myself. I knew this was just the beginning of the game Claudia had set in motion. She wanted to make me an example so that everyone else would see the HOA could crush anyone who dared to be different. The next day, I noticed the change in my neighbor's eyes. People no longer greeted me when I walked by. Kids who used to play with my daughter were now pulled away by their parent. One child innocently asked out loud, "Mom, is Mr. Gray being punished for being poor?" The entire street fell silent, with only the wind rustling through the trees. My daughter stood still, her small hand gripping mine tightly, her eyes glistening. That night at dinner, she asked softly, "Daddy, why do they hate us? Is it because we're a different color?" I looked straight into those young eyes and had no answer. All I could do was pull her into my arms, hoping she could feel the protection I wanted to give. But inside me, a deep, raw wound tearing open with every heart. I understood that Claudia was using a subtle tactic to take me down. She didn't need to lift a finger, just a few posted notices, a few contemptuous remarks, and the community would slowly turn its back. The silence of the neighbors was complicity, and I felt myself being pushed into the role of an outsider. I remembered when the bridge was destroyed. Back then, I had been stunned, but I could still tell myself it was just a sudden act of violence. Now I realized Claudia was orchestrating a long-term psychological game, a systematic smear campaign. She didn't just want me to lose the bridge, she wanted me to lose the respect, the sense of belonging in this neighborhood. I became the main subject of conversation in the parking lot. A middle-aged man leaned against his car and said to a friend, "People like that don't belong in Lakeshore." Claudia did the right thing. Comment wasn't just agreement, it was a nod to the discrimination already taking root. I walked past in silence, doing my best not to show the anger rising inside, but deep down, fierce resolve was beginning to burn. I'm not someone who folds easily. I've lived through the darkest days after my wife passed, swallowed grief to stand up and raise my daughter, and now Claudia thought a few petty citations and cheap insults would bring me down? It couldn't be more wrong. That night, I sat alone by the window, staring out at the quiet lake. The water reflected the moonlight, but to me, it looked like a battlefield. Claudia wanted to claim it, to use it as a symbol of her power, but she didn't know that this very place would become the beginning of her downfall. My daughter was fast asleep, but I couldn't close my eyes. The sound of insects outside reminded me that life here was being twisted by those who believed they had the right to judge. I knew this smear campaign wouldn't stop. It would escalate, trying to make me the thorn that had to be removed. But in that moment, I made a vow to myself. I would not let Claudia turn me into a target for her arrogance. The next day, I passed the HOA office again. Claudia was speaking with a group of residents, her voice full of pride. Lakeshore Estates must uphold its standards. We can't let anyone do whatever they want. All eyes turned toward me, and I heard a few murmurs ripple through the group. I said nothing. I just looked Claudia in the eye. Her gaze met mine, and her lips curled into a smile that seemed to say, "You are nothing here." I turned away, but inside, my decision was made. If she wanted to make me a joke, then I would turn her arrogance into the knife that cuts back. Claudia had no idea I held a secret, a power she never imagined, and one day, this lake would witness everything. I had endured enough. Enough of the contemptuous glances that slid past and turned away, as if my daughter and I were a stain on the spotless glass of this neighborhood. Enough of the whispers, the crooked smiles behind my back, when they thought I couldn't hear, but I always heard, and I had stayed silent. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I believed silence could sometimes preserve peace, especially for my daughter, the child I wanted to grow up in stability, not smeared, pointless confrontation. But when that notice, the one scrawled in red with "Regulation Violation, Illegal Structure Removed," was posted in plain view at my front gate like a charge sheet, like a stain deliberately displayed, I understood that patience was no longer an option. This was no longer just about me. This was the question my daughter had asked, tearful eyes. "Daddy, why did no one stop?" And I knew that if I didn't act, she would grow up with a warped idea of justice. I needed an answer not just for me, for her. That morning, I put on a dark coat, stepped into worn shoes, and walked out the door with a different feeling, not the usual caution, but the cold clarity of someone who had reached the edge. The HOA office sat at the center of the neighborhood, a small, repurposed house with a spotless, boxy exterior, utterly soulless. White-painted walls, a walkway paved in perfect symmetry, the interior lined with oversized photos of model homes, lawns trimmed to perfection, koi ponds gleaming like pages from a catalog. Everything was designed to project order and success, but I couldn't help sensing an invisible chill over the place, as if all real emotion had been pushed out beyond its door. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, creaking hinges cutting through the perfect silence inside. A few people looked up from their desks, surprise flashing briefly before turning into scrutiny. I walked straight ahead, no waiting, no small talk. Claudia Harrow sat at the far end of the room, behind a large dark wood desk, framed by a tall window looking out onto a perfectly green lawn. She turned around as if she'd known I would come. Her blonde hair was tied high, her beige business outfit without a single, and her face the face with that thread-thin smile, cold as the wind off the lake on a winter morning. "I assume you're here about the bridge," she said first, her voice slow but laced with boredom, as though I were a nuisance cutting into her valuable time. "If you want it back," she leaned forward slightly, "submit a special fee of $25,000. The HOA board will consider allowing reconstruction." I stood there, silent, not because of the money but because of how brazen she was. I ground out my words, my voice rough. "You destroyed my family's legacy, and now you're asking for ransom? That wasn't just a bridge, it was a memory, a bond between me and my daughter, and you think you have the right to turn that into a bargaining chip?" Claudia narrowed her eyes, her lips curling into an irritated smile. "You should remember you're living in our neighborhood," she emphasized the last two words like a hammer hitting stone. "This is Lakeshore Estate, not a place where just anyone can come in and do whatever they want. Someone like you is lucky to even be here. Don't mistake that for having equal standing." Her words landed in my ears like a dull blade dragging slowly. I felt the blood rush to my face, my heart pounding hard, but I didn't yell. I just stood there, staring straight at her. No blinking, no backing down. Claudia gave a faint smile, the kind worn by someone convinced they're holding all the cards, or so they believe. I turned and walked away, not saying another word. My footsteps echoed through the tiled hallway, each one heavy like a drumbeat. Fear, but from anger. Quiet, focused anger. As the door slammed shut behind me, I felt my hand tremble, not cold, from the fire now lit inside me that couldn't be put out. I walked the stone path back to my house, morning sunlight streaming through the rustling trees. Everything around me looked the same: manicured lawns, perfect fences, large homes sitting quietly behind drawn curtains. But in my mind, the whole neighborhood had become a stage where every player now wore a visible mask. For years, I had stayed silent, had chosen to lower my head so my daughter could grow up in peace, to hold on to the fragile quiet we had left. I accepted the whispers, the veiled HOA meeting, the absurd rules dressed up as standard. But today, Claudia didn't just destroy the bridge, she shattered the last piece of silence I had managed. I remembered my daughter's face as she read the notice. Her eyes were wide, staring like she couldn't believe what she saw. She didn't cry like she had when the bridge was torn down, but I could see the disappointment clearly. "Do they hate us because we're different, Daddy?" Question haunted me every night. I couldn't let her believe silence meant agreement, meant surrender. I couldn't let her grow up thinking her worth was smaller just because our house was smaller, because we didn't drive the same cars. I had to do something. Not to prove anything to Claudia, but to prove to my daughter that her father didn't stay silent forever. That dignity isn't something anyone gets to buy or take away. When I reached my gate, I stopped. The lake before me was still calm, but to my eyes, it was no longer a peaceful mirror. It was a battlefield, the beginning of something new. I took a deep breath. The air was fresh, but inside me, a storm had begun. I knew from this moment on, everything had changed. Claudia could feel secure with the entire HOA machine behind her, with rules they made, with the support of those who sat still, while power human decency. But she didn't know she had just crossed the last line. I will not attend another HOA meeting to listen to hollow lectures about morality. I will not file a request to keep what already belongs to my memory. I will not pay a single cent to ransom back the bridge that was erased with contempt. Instead, I will step into this fight on my own terms, patient but not weak, quiet but not submissive. From that moment on, I was no longer the man who suffered in silence. I had become Claudia Harrow's opponent, and I would not back down until she tasted humiliation right where she reigned as queen. If your HOA openly destroyed your property and then insulted you like this, would you stay silent back? Drop your answer in the comment. I knew Claudia wouldn't stop at public shaming. The way she spoke so casually about standards made it clear everything she did had a deeper purpose. A small wooden bridge wasn't worth bringing in trucks, workers, and that much venom unless there was more behind it. I decided I had to find out the truth. In the days that followed, I spent hours at the county land records office. Stacks of files, faded map, legal clauses so fine they blurred my vision. But the deeper I dug, the more undeniable it became. The bridge wasn't removed for aesthetic. It was removed because it blocked the view from the resort on the far side of the lake. That resort had only been built a few years earlier, with a luxurious facade and glittering lights at night. Valued at over $4 million, it was marketed as an exclusive retreat for the wealthy. With a waterfront location, every detail of the scenery had to be flawless. And my family's humble wooden bridge, to those in the business of luxury, was an eyesore. I kept digging through documents related to the lake. In one carefully flagged file, I found Claudia's name. Vague paperwork described negotiations for long-term usage rights of lake surface area under Lakeshore Estate. When I cross-referenced it with the resort's permits, it hit me. Claudia was quietly arranging to sell off access to the lake to the resort owners. I sat still in the reading room, my hand gripping the printed sheet. Everything clicked into place. Claudia didn't just destroy the bridge to assert dominance, she was preparing to turn the entire lake into a revenue stream. In her plan, the lake was no longer a space for residents to relax and reflect, but a backdrop to decorate a stay for those who could afford a night in luxury. The more I thought about it, the more disgusted I felt. Her words to me, "This is Lakeshore Estates, not some cheap public park," now stood bare. She saw us, the people who had lived and breathed every quiet corner of that lake, as trash standing in the way of profit. And the bridge, the symbol of my family's memories, was merely the first sacrifice. I left the county office in the late afternoon. Sunlight glanced off the lake, sending golden ripples across the water. But to me, the entire picturesque scene now looked like a stage set. The gleaming resort in the distance appeared like a giant beast with its jaws wide open, and Claudia was the one pulling the strings behind it, ready to discard anyone who didn't serve her ambition. That night, I spread the documents across the table. My daughter walked over, looked at the stack of files, and asked softly, "Are you trying to get our bridge back, Daddy?" I didn't answer directly. I ran a hand through her hair and said, "I want you to know the truth, so you don't grow up thinking they took the bridge because they hated us. They took it because someone wants to take the whole lake for themselves." In my daughter's eyes, I saw confusion, mixed with something that looked pain. I knew she didn't grasp the full complexity of adult scheme, but she could feel injustice, and that made me even more certain I had to keep going. I couldn't let Claudia turn this community into a chessboard where she moved every piece as she pleased. As night fell, I sat alone, staring out at the dark lake. The wind blew hard, rippling the water's surface. I knew Claudia never expected anyone to stare directly into her plan, but I had seen it clearly, and from now on, I understood I was no longer on defense. I had found her weakness, her greed. The bridge was gone, my name dragged through the mud, but that was just the opening act. A bigger stage was waiting, and whether I wanted it or not, I had become the lead character. In the files I had sifted through, there was a stack of printed emails. My eyes stopped on a thread between Claudia and a resort representative. The line stood out, unfiltered, unashamed. "Clear out the cheap stuff around the lake. VIP guests don't like the look of poverty." I read that line over and over, a tightness rising in my chest. So this wasn't about safety or aesthetics. That was just the excuse. What Claudia really wanted was a polished, stripped of anything humble, so she could sell it as part of a contract with the resort. To her, the bridge wasn't a family's memory or a piece of a community's identity. It was just cheap stuff, a blemish to erase so rich guests wouldn't have to frown. My entire family, and even the everyday residents around the lake, were just excess background in the glossy sales pitch putting together. I sat in silence for a long while. Every puzzle piece is now locked into. Claudia never cared about the community. She treated the HOA as her personal shield to manipulate at will. She used her authority to shape the rules, then used those same rules to pave the way for her private. And this deal wasn't small, it was worth millions. I remembered the way her mouth curled when she said, "This is Lakeshore Estate, not some cheap public park." That sentence now stood naked in its truth. She discriminated not just by race or background, but by how much value she placed on a person's wallet. If you weren't rich enough, clean-cut enough, appealing enough, you'd be erased, discredited, devalued. In that moment, I felt bitterness, but also clarity. I realized I wasn't just dealing with a power-hungry individual. I was up against someone willing to sell out the entire community for personal gain. This was a much bigger fight. I stacked the papers and looked out the window. The lake lay still, but to my eyes, it had become a mirror reflecting greed. The resort shimmered across the water like a block of pressure stone, and Claudia was sharpening every move to turn this place into her private playground for the wealthy. I clenched my fist, feeling a rush of blood surge through my body. I no longer felt alone. The bridge was only the first thing to fall, and if I stayed silent, many more would be buried. Claudia had sold us all out, and she believed no one would dare raise their head in defiance. That night, after my daughter had fallen asleep, I sat at the table, laying out the emails like evidence in a quiet courtroom. I whispered to myself, if she thinks she can turn the lake into her own property, then she's never known the limits of consequence. I knew I had just touched the ugly, but essential. This was no longer about a bridge. This was about an entire community betrayed. And if I wanted to protect my family's memories, if I wanted my daughter to grow up without lowering her head, I had to turn that into a weapon. Claudia Harrow might think she was in control of everything, but it was her ambition that exposed her weakness. And I, the one she dismissed as cheap, now held the spark that could burn down the false castle she had built. I knew Claudia wouldn't stop at notices or office sarcasm. She wasn't just someone who craved control, she craved worship, needed eyes looking up at her, needed an audience to witness her display of power. She didn't just want the bridge gone, she wanted to erase its meaning, to turn someone else's pain into her stage, placing herself at the center to receive applause from an obedient crowd. And the wine party by the lakeside right where my family's wooden bridge once stood was the performance she had carefully planned. Not accidental, not coincidental, every detail arranged to prove she could destroy anything, and no one would dare speak out. Lights were strung along the lake's edge, hanging from decorative metal frames like preparations for a lavish wedding. The warm glow reflected on the water, gentle ripples glittering like gold-threaded satin. Jazz music drifted from hidden speakers, slow melodies seemingly meant to soften the sharp power hanging in the air. The tables were draped in pristine white linens, tall vases bursting with lilies and lavender, red wine swirled in crystal glasses, and elegant trays of canapes, arranged with precision. Residents arrived in formal wear black suits, evening gowns, polished shoes, and they mingled loudly, laughing without pause. At a glance, it looked like a refined cultural celebration, a community gathering in harmony beside the lake, but to me, it was a mass, carefully directed play meant to highlight one thing only: the power, Claudia Harrow. She appeared as if scripted to be the star. A white tailored suit hugged her frame, her hair pinned up neatly, her high heels striking the ground with calculated confidence. She walked slowly, like a queen inspecting her parade, every gesture and nod radiating self-satisfaction. When she arrived, the crowd quiet for a beat, then broke into applause like they'd rehearsed it. Claudia smiled, raised her glass in a toast, then spoke just loud enough for everyone to hear. The lake looks much cleaner now without someone's clunky little bridge ruining the view. The last word had barely dropped when laughter broke out sharp, clean, like knives. Some people patted each other on the back, others giggled behind hands, and a few glanced toward me and my daughter. Those looks held no sympathy. They were the eyes of people who had chosen a side, the strong side, cold, complicit, and without hesitation. I felt my daughter squeeze my hand. Her small fingers trembled, her face flushed with shame and fury. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew we had become the punchline. Claudia moved slowly through the crowd and stopped near us. She dipped her head slightly, as if to show politeness, but the words she whispered were sharp enough to sear. People like you should be grateful we still let you exist here. Her voice was low but firm, each word a hammer strike against my dignity. I looked straight into her eyes, without flinching. In the warm yellow light, I saw satisfaction, a twisted kind of pleasure in watching someone else be diminished. Claudia didn't need to shout, didn't need to insult me in public. All it took was a few carefully chosen words to turn my daughter's and my existence into a joke. My daughter lowered her head, her eyes shimmering with tears she refused to let fall, placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her the calm I had no choice but to summon. I couldn't lose control because that was exactly what Claudia was waiting for. This wasn't an emotional clash. It was a psychological game I had to play by her rules for now. Claudia walked away, blending into the crowd, raising their glass in celebration. I sat still, watching her retreating figure, my chest heavy as stone. The shame piled on not because of the bridge, not because of the mockery, but because I had been humiliated in front of my daughter, turned into the living example of what this community saw as someone who didn't belong. Around me, no one said a word. Some pretended not to notice, others gave forced smiles before returning to the party air. They had chosen silence not because they agreed, but because they were afraid. Afraid to be seen siding with the weak, afraid of being noticed, afraid that if they spoke up, they'd be next. neck. I didn't blame them, but I understood clearly that kind of silence was its own cruelty. And I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't walk past, not ever again. I lifted my gaze to the lake. The lights cast flickering gold across the water's surface. It looked peaceful, but to me, it was no longer a place of calm. It had become a battlefield, a stage where Claudia displayed her conquest. But I knew, right there, it would also be the place where the fight back would begin. My daughter turned to me and whispered, her voice small but full of hurt, "Daddy, I don't want to stay here anymore." I gripped her hand, leaned in, and whispered back, "There will come a day when you won't have to." I promised. It wasn't a promise of comfort. It was a vow etched deep in me. I would not let her grow up remembering her father bowing to injustice. I glanced at Claudia one last time. She was raising her glass, laughing with the wealthiest residents in the neighborhood, her face glowing as if the victory were complete. But she didn't know that in that very moment, I had made my decision. Tonight's public humiliation was the final drop. No more retreating, no more compromise. That night, I took my daughter home in silence. She rested her head on my shoulder, her eyes sad but no longer frightened. I held her close and looked out at the dark lake, where the lights had begun to fade. I whispered, not aloud but to myself, as a vow carved in stone, "Claudia Harrow, you've taken this too far, and I'll show you the cost of arrogance." And the party ended with laughter, applause echoing across the lakeside as if everything had been settled. But beneath all that noise, I heard another sound, quiet one, clear and steady, the beat of my own heart, no longer the rhythm of someone who accepts, but the rhythm of a man preparing to strike. From this moment on, nothing would ever be the same. After that humiliating party, I came home with a feeling that was hard to put into words. It wasn't just anger, and it wasn't exactly shame. It was a fusion of all the worst emotions a person could endure in a single night. I felt stripped bare under the lights, like someone who didn't belong, singled out in front of a crowd with no way out. I opened the door in silence. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the hallway light, reflecting off the wooden floor. My daughter was already asleep, her small face still marked by sadness after a night too heavy for a child to bear. I sat down in the chair without turning on the light, letting the room stay wrapped in gentle dark. On the table were old files I had once stored away in a wooden cabinet, papers I never thought would matter. Until now. They had been left by my father years ago, bundled in a worn paper envelope, its edges frayed, dust. He had once known every inch of this land, every bend in the water, a man who lived quietly but carried great responsibility. I flipped through the pages, the sound of rustling paper steady in the stillness of the late night. Each sheet bore the marks, time-yellowed edges, typewritten word, faded red stamp. I read every line carefully, and then, the truth revealed itself, clear as if my father were standing beside me, pointing right at it. The water control dam feeding into the lake, the structure everyone believed belonged to the HOA, was in fact located on a parcel of land legally deeded to my family more than half a century ago. The documents were clear, bearing the state's official seal at the time, with maps, signatures, and all legal validation. Everything was legitimate. I remembered my father mentioning it once, but I never thought it would matter in today's world, until this very moment, when justice screamed inside me, and those papers suddenly became a weapon one Claudia knew nothing about. I leaned back in the chair and took a deep breath, my heart pounding as if I couldn't believe what I had just found. Claudia's face flashed through my mind, her smile glowing as she humiliated me before a crowd. If she wanted to turn this lake into her private domain to serve a resort, if she saw me as an obstacle to be removed, then now I held something she couldn't touch, the water. The next day, the sky was overcast, the air thick and damp, the kind of weather that made everything feel heavier. I drove down the narrow path, leading to the dam, the same path my father used to walk every morning to check the flow. The dam sat deep within a sparse grove of trees, isolated from the neighborhood. The structure was aged, coated with moss, concrete walls stained with time, steel beams rusted and dotted with red flecks like dried blood. But as I stood there in front of the massive steel gate, I didn't see decay. I saw strength, a preserved memory standing firm. I placed my hand on the cold surface of the valve door, my heart thundering, not fear but from the clarity that even the smallest action could shift everything. I closed my eyes and let the worst images flood in, the sound of the chainsaw tearing through the bridge, my daughter's sobs by the lake. Claudia's cruel words poured into my ear like acid, everything that had happened up to now, condensed into a single current of energy, focused entirely on the arm gripping the valve handle. I whispered, my voice low and hoarse like a sentence being passed. "You want this lake to be yours? Then carry the weight of an empty one." And I turned the valve. First, the metal groaned, dry and stubborn, as if the world itself resisted my act. But then, suddenly, the water surged. A roar filled the dark chamber, strong and wild, like the cry of a beast finally loosed from its chain. I stood still, feeling the vibration under my feet, hearing the water crash against stone, rushing down the outflow drop by drop, reclaiming every inch of dignity that had been taken. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio, didn't think about anything except how Claudia would react. In just a few days, the water would drop, the mudflats would emerge, and that multi-million-dollar resort would lose its most prized feature. I pictured her face going pale, scrambling to call a meeting, only to discover no one had the authority to stop me because I held the key to the flow. The entire polished system was draining now, one drop at a time, one mask at a time. That night, after my daughter had fallen asleep, I returned to the table not to search, but to prepare. I laid out every document about the dam, marked each page, checked every stamp, and arranged them in order. The desk lamp cast a soft, golden light. In my mind was the image of my father, the man who had quietly protected all of this until the end of his life. And now, I was using what he left behind to protect my family. I wasn't doing it out of satisfaction. I was doing it because there was no other choice. The next day, the lake began to drop. First, no one noticed the change was too gradual. The surface barely altered. But within days, the stones along the edge began to show, and patches of shoreline grass turned dry under the sunday. I heard whispers from the residents, some blaming the dry season, others suspecting the resort's irrigation system was overdrawn. But I knew. I watched from a distance, my eyes no longer afraid. I saw engineers from the resort come out to inspect, anxious. And I knew time was doing its work. A strange feeling rose within me, not exactly joy but balance, as if the scale Claudia had tipped for so long had finally been pushed back. I didn't feel happiness watching the lake recede, but I didn't feel regret either, because sometimes someone has to break the illusion of so that truth has a chance to exist. Claudia chose to play ruthlessly, and now she was tasting exactly what she sowed. I stood by the window, looking out at the lake. The water was no longer calm, it was gray and murky. The moonlight spilled over it, not shimmering like before, but smeared, cold. I saw one thing clearly. This wasn't just a battle for dignity. It was a declaration for everyone who had ever been trampled by the HOA, ever been dismissed for not fitting their mold. And I whispered, a vow for the rest of my life. The game starts now, and this time, I hold the water. Call to action. If you were in my place, would you dare open the dam to make the one who shattered your family pay the price? Leave your thoughts in the comments. The roar of rushing water echoed for days, loud and chaotic like a dissonant orchestra, tearing apart the quiet of the entire neighborhood. Each surge carried away the pride Claudia had built for herself. The lake level dropped steadily on the first day. Lines of exposed soil appeared at the edge. On the second, moss-covered stones rose above the surface. By the third day, the lake was no longer a smooth mirror but a jagged pool, the muddy bed beginning to emerge in disarray. And then, the $4 million resort she had always flaunted could no longer hide the truth. It had been built on an illusion. The guests who once sipped wine on the balconies, proudly snapping check-in photos with the backdrop of a pristine lake, were now scrambling to pack. They dragged suitcases, crowded the front desk, some shouting in frustration, others visibly panicked. Staff ran frantically some barking orders, others hauling firewater tanks as if they could replace nature's law. But water that rushes out can't be stopped to plastic buckets. I stood far enough away to see the entire resort. The white stone steps were now stained with failure. Decorative fountains jutted out like crooked grins, and the once opulent scenery had turned into a stage of chaos. And in the middle of it all, I saw Claudia. She was still in her white suit, gripping a walkie-talkie, shouting loud enough to echo through the entire courtyard. Shut it down now! I don't want to lose another drop. Low. Her voice cracked, sharp, frantic, as if trying to claw back the inevitable. I saw a few engineers buried in control panel, but within minutes, they were shaking their heads in defeat. The pumps roared, then sputtered into silence. The pipes shuddered and fell still. There was no saving it. The water pouring out, every inch of the lake draining like a sentence already written. By the fourth day, the lake bed was fully exposed, like a massive scar. Withered weeds, scattered dead fish, and a sharp stench made the entire resort suffocating. The luxurious swimming pool, once the pride of glossy magazine spreads, was now cracked, peeling, tiles popping loose, trails of water pooling in broken line. I watched it all, and something in me settled, not because I took joy in nature's ruin, but because Claudia's arrogance had finally met its limit. I kept still, eyes tracking every reaction. Some guests screamed for refunds, and others recorded the scene to post online. The extravagance Claudia once promised had become a public joke, and that, more than anything, made me feel that justice was finding its way back. She had humiliated me in front of the community, cast me as an outsider, but now, hundreds of eyes were watching her fall apart. Claudia refused to give up. She stormed down the hallway, shouting into her walkie-talkie, her voice slicing through the air. Get more, block the valves, stop it at all costs. But every command was like pouring salt into the sea. I saw the panic in her every move. Her once pristine white suit was streaked with mud and dust, her blonde hair in disarray, stripped of all the poise and power she had worn when she stood before the community and humiliated me. The resort crumbled before my eyes like a sandcastle swallowed by the tide. I took a deep breath, letting the damp, musty wind brush against my face. Inside me, There was no longer the fury of days past, but the calm of someone witnessing justice return after being stolen for too long. I remembered that first night when the bridge was destroyed, the sound of my daughter sobbing, Claudia's cruel eyes as she told me I only existed here by luck. All those memories blended into this moment. The $4 million resort had fallen not because of a storm, not because of some accident, but because greed and arrogance carried it to this end. I turned and walked away, no longer needing to hear the shouting or watch the chaos unfold. In my heart, the story already had its answer. The lake was drained, but inside me was something full relief. On the way home, my daughter took my hand and asked, her voice trembling, "Daddy, did we make the lake go away?" I looked into her innocent eyes and answered slowly, "Yeah." And that's how they'll learn they keep stepping on people. She was quiet for a long time, then nodded. In her eyes was a young understanding, but also a kind of I hadn't seen before. Night fell, and I looked out at the lake again, now just mud under moonlight. I knew this was only the beginning. Claudia wouldn't let it go. She would push back, would scheme. But I also knew that for the first time in years, the scale had tipped in my favor. And from this moment forward, I was no longer the humiliated one. I was the one in control. I whispered, as much to myself as to Claudia, "Justice has been restored, and this lake will no longer be your weapon." I stepped away from the window and shut it firmly. In my heart, a new chapter had begun not just for me and my daughter, but for everyone who had lived under the ruthless grip of Claudia Harrow. The next morning, as I sat on the porch with a steaming cup of coffee in my hands, the bitter aroma curling into the early breeze, the blare of car horns echoed across the lake. First came a truck bearing the logo of the local television station, followed by a long caravan SUVs marked with media decals, technical vans, reporters with press badges, cameramen, and microphone operators rushing toward the resort on the far side of the lake. The news spread with a speed that felt almost unreal, as if someone had flipped a switch and triggered a media siege from the shadows. Photos of the drained lake bed, cracked mud, and sunlight casting raw shadows across the wounds of the earth flooded social media within hours. The headlines were bold, blunt, slicing straight through the mask Claudia had spent so long constructing. $1 million resort dries up under HOA power grab. HOA. Local news channels dispatched crews to the scene, anchors in blazers standing solemnly before the camera, panned to capture every angle, residents murmuring, tourists fuming, resort staff scrambling like headless chicken. The once serene air of Lakeshore Estates now felt more like a stage unveiling buried truths than a luxury retreat. I stood at a distance, coffee now cold in hand, not part of the growing crowd, but every whispered complaint, every dissatisfied glance, every camera lens sweeping back and forth told me one thing. Clearly, the wave of outrage was rising. Claudia finally appeared, stepping out of the familiar luxury SUV. But today, everything was different. Her face was pale as ash, dark circles under sleepless eyes, her hair no longer neatly pinned but falling limp around her temples. The white suit she once kept immaculate was now streaked with dust, wrinkled with lines like fractures in her pride. She walked slowly, trying to hold her posture, but the exhaustion and panic were impossible to mask. Porters closed in like wolves catching the scent of blood, microphones pointed at her face, cameras clicked non-stop, and a flurry of questions flew like arrows. Did you sell lake rights to the resort? Why was this hidden from residents? Claudia, do you take responsibility for this disaster? She inhaled deeply, straightened her back, trying to summon the voice that used to command silence across the community. It's just a technical issue. The valve system malfunctioned. We're working to resolve it. The lake will return to normal soon. That voice, once firm as stone, now trembled, as if fearing its own words would collapse beneath them. But no one believed her. A reporter held up a stack of documents and read aloud, each word cutting with clarity. Clear out the cheap stuff around the lake. VIP guests don't like the look of poverty. That very email, the one I had quietly sent the day before, had become the fatal blow. The crowd began to stir, residents shaking their heads, some pulling out phones to record, others firing off text updates to family. In that moment, Claudia, the one once dubbed the Queen of the HOA, was stripped bare before the very community she had once ruled over. Her face visibly drained of color, her eyes darting for an escape, but there was no safe corner amid the storm of public scrutiny. Every question, every camera click, every flash of light was like 100 blades slicing through the painted facade of power she had so carefully constructed. I didn't push to the front of the cameras, didn't shout for justice. I simply stood within the crowd and let the truth do its work. The outrage of once silent neighbors, the disappointment of angry tourists, and the undeniable proof in that email, all of it was a verdict Claudia could not escape. Her eyes met mine once, no words exchanged, just a glance. But in that look, there was no challenge, no contempt like the smirk she wore when the bridge fell. There was only fear. The deep, unmistakable fear of someone who knew they had lost everything. I was about to turn away when the reporter continued reading the final lines of the email aloud, along with detailed screenshots. Remove the wooden bridge and all remnants from legacy residents. The landscape must reflect international resort standards. The crowd nearly erupted. Some residents burst into applause. Someone shouted, "I knew it." Others pointed directly at Claudia, their eyes sharp with the urge to expose her. Claudia swayed, as if hit by wind on an open shore. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. Her lips moved uselessly. The assistant at her side had already stepped back, leaving her to fend for herself. In that moment, Claudia transformed figure of authority into the emblem of a decayed system. An elderly woman from the neighborhood, who had lived there since the early days, stepped forward. Her voice trembled, but every word rang clear. "You used us as a stepping stone for your greed. We've been silent for far too long." That sentence was the final spark that lit the smoldering fire. Applause broke out, wave after wave, crashing against Claudia like the surf against the shore. This was no polite applause, it was the sound of justice, a sound that confirmed truth had finally prevailed. I remained silent, standing there among them, not needing to say a single word. Everything I ever needed had been spoken by the crowd, by the media. Claudia's own betrayal laid bare in. She looked around, desperate for something to cling to, but every gaze either averted or burned with contempt. At last, she turned away, staggering, her white suit streaked, her golden hair limp and lifeless, no longer resembling the woman who once sat behind a leather desk and ordered the destruction of my bridge as if wiping away a stain. I let out a long breath, not out of satisfaction but of relief. Justice doesn't always come from a courtroom, doesn't always carry an official seal. Sometimes, it arrives in the simplest form, a light cast on the truth at the right moment, a community finally willing to see it. Today, Claudia was forced to see herself through that lens, exposed, frail, and defeated. And for the first time since I set foot in Lakeshore Estates, I felt I was no longer alone. As word of the exposed truth spread throughout the neighborhood, I began to notice a distinct shift in my neighbors' behavior. Those who used to avoid my eyes, who once hurriedly pulled their children away when my daughter appeared, now approached us willingly. They no longer whispered harsh words behind our back, but looked me straight in the eye with respect. One morning, just as I was wheeling my bike out of the garage, a middle-aged man from the row of houses across the street walked over. He stopped, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said slowly, "You did what we didn't dare to. We owe you more than we can say." I simply nodded, not needing thanks, because I understood his words came from the fear and submission they had endured far too long. By evening, a group of residents had gathered outside my house. They didn't come to protest or attack as they once did, but to show solidarity. A young woman, her voice trembling yet firm, said, "We've known for a long time that Claudia has been manipulating everything, but none of us had the courage to stand up. Seeing you do it made us realize that silence only makes her stronger." The steady stream of nods around her made me see that the psychological barrier in this community had finally begun to crack. The next day, I received a handshake I would remember for the rest of my life. An elderly veteran, dark-skinned with silver streaks in his hair, came to find me. His hand gripped mine, strong yet trembling. His eyes were red, glistening with restrained tears. He spoke softly but firmly, "You've reclaimed dignity for all of us. I used to think I'd grown numb to being looked down on, but watching you stand up to her made me feel like I could hold my head high again." His words left me speechless. I felt the weight of not just his years, but of the quiet endurance he had lived through. As I held his hand, a warm current surged through me, as if my resolve had transferred to the entire community. After that, many others came too. They shared their own stories of unjust fines, of vague rules used to intimidate, of the harsh discrimination Claudia imposed. Their voices were full of long-held frustration, now replaced courage. I listened to every word, every detail, every sigh, and I realized that my fight was no longer just for the bridge or my own dignity. It had become the voice of an entire community that had been silenced too long. At an emergency town meeting organized by the residents themselves, attendance was higher than ever before. No one flinched under Claudia's gaze anymore, because she no longer sat in the HOA president's chair with her usual arrogance. People began discussing the formation of a temporary council, reviewing all the regulations imposed by the old HOA, and filing a lawsuit to hold Claudia accountable. Sitting in that packed room, I saw faces that had once been downcast now lifted high. Their voices rose in unison, strong and steady. I knew then that this was the moment the community had awakened. As the meeting ended, I stepped outside, the cool breeze blowing across the drained lake. Residents came up one by one to shake my hand, not as the powerless thanking a savior, but with empathy, as equals. They saw me now as an essential part of this new beginning. I looked around and saw my daughter standing in the back row, smiling with pride. I knew she had witnessed this transformation, and from now on, she would no longer ask ask me why people hated us. She would understand that when one person stands up, others will find the courage to follow, and that is the true value of justice. The meeting went on late into the night, but no one left their seat. Each voice raised in anger, each accusation, came like a flood washing away the fear that had hung over Lakeshore Estates for years. One person stood up, voice firm. "We can't let her stay in the president's seat another minute." Dozens of voices agreed instantly, joined by waves of applause. A petition to remove Claudia circulated swiftly. Within half an hour, signatures covered the pages. The names that once remained silent now appeared without hesitation. When the list was read aloud to the room, cheers erupted, drowning out the weak protests of the few allies Claudia had left. Claudia sat hunched in the corner, her face. She no longer stood to justify herself, no longer raised her voice to scold, only stared at the stack of paper that had become her removal notice. An elderly resident stood and declared clearly, "As of today, Claudia Harrow is no longer president of the HOA. This board will be restructured from the ground up. No one will have the power to turn this place into a tool for personal gain." Applause rang out again, but this time, it wasn't just for celebration, it was a cleansing ritual. A community long weighed down by oppression had found the chance to begin again. I stood in the center of the crowd, quietly observing, something indescribable rise in my chest. I didn't triumph at Claudia's downfall, but relief at seeing the community finally break its silence. Everything I had done preserving the evidence, standing my ground, opening the floodgate now revealed its true purpose. Not to exact revenge, but to open a new path. I looked around the room and met the eyes of my neighbors. They no longer saw me as an outsider, no longer whispered judgments behind my back. Their eyes were bright, filled with gratitude, with respect, and with a newfound courage. A young woman stepped forward and said softly, "You showed us that silence only feeds injustice. Now we'll never be silent again." Outside the hall, the night wind swept across the drained lake, carrying the rustle of branches in its wake. I took a long breath and felt the air had changed. The heaviness that once pressed on my shoulders was gone, placed by hope. Claudia's removal wasn't just the end of an era of authoritarianism, but the beginning of a community learning to protect its dignity. I held my daughter's hand. She looked up at me with shining eyes. "Dad," she whispered, "did we win?" I smiled and answered slowly, "Not just us, but everyone." She nodded, then leaned into my shoulder, as if she had finally found the safety she'd been missing for so long. I understood the road ahead would still be difficult. Reforming the HOA wouldn't happen overnight. There would be debates, divisions, and resistance. But the very fact that the community had found the courage to rise was already a victory. I was no longer alone in this fight. More importantly, I had seen trust rekindled in the hearts of people who once lived with their heads down. I turned back to glance at the brightly lit room, where residents were still gathered, discussing the future. In that moment, I realized it was resistance that had opened a new path, not just for me and my daughter, but for all of Lakeshore Estate. A path where justice was no longer a distant dream, but something within reach when people dared to stand up. After the days of chaos, the lake had yet to refill. The water lay still, lower than before, exposing cracked earth along the shoreline. Though the scene felt desolate, when I held my daughter's hand and stepped down, I saw her smile softly. Her eyes lit up, not because of the lake, but because of everything she had just witnessed over the past days. We stopped at the patch of land where the bridge once connected. She sat down and tossed a stone into the distance. It skipped once, then vanished into a small ripple. I sat beside her, watching her quietly. In her gaze, there was no longer confusion from overhearing neighbors' mockery, no more shame from being made a spectacle. That gaze now was clear, steady, and full of confidence. I spoke slowly, making sure she understood every word. Sometimes you have to strike back so the wrongdoer understands what justice means. If we stay silent, we'll think we accept. But when we stand up, we're not just protecting ourselves, we're standing up for everyone around us. She turned to me, her face more serious than her age. "You did what no one else dared to do. I'm proud of you, Dad." I smiled gently, resting my hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to be proud. Just remember that no one has the right to take away your dignity. Wherever you are, you hold on to that." We sat together a while longer. I told her stories about her grandfather, about the years he had protected this land and the dam, about how he always told me that every rightful claim must be defended with resilience. She listened, her eyes wide, as if etching every word into memory. From a distance, a few neighbors on their evening walks paused to look our way and nodded. They no longer kept their distance, no longer cast skeptical glances. Between them and me, there was now respect. I realized the community had changed. Claudia's downfall wasn't merely the fall of a petty tyrant, it marked the beginning of a neighborhood willing to reflect and repair. My daughter stood up, took my hand tightly, and said with determination, "One day, if someone like Claudia shows up again, I won't be afraid. Her words moved me. She didn't just understand. She carried the belief that justice can be achieved, truth and dignity are always worth fighting for. We left the lakeshore together, the sunset casting long shadows across the path. I knew the bridge would never return as it once was, but in my heart, another bridge had formed, one between father and daughter, one that reconnected a once fractured community into something stronger. As we walked, I thought to myself, every wound leaves a scar, but those scars are proof of strength. And from now on, Lakeshore Estates would no longer be ruled by arrogance, but live with awareness. I believed that because I had seen an entire community rise together, the lake would eventually refill, but the most precious thing my daughter and I had gained would never fade: the belief justice always exists, as long as we have the courage to claim it. My daughter stayed silent for a long moment, then suddenly gripped my hand, her gaze more resolute than ever. Her voice rang out, firm though still slightly trembling. "You taught me no one has the right to put us down." My throat tightened. The child who once sobbed when the bridge was torn down had now grasped the most important truth. She was no longer just a kid enduring the contempt of others, she had discovered her own worth. I squeezed her hand and nodded in place of a reply. The two of us stood before the drained lake, where once the reflection of my family shimmered across the surface. I whispered, part message to the past, part declaration to the present. The bridge may be gone, but we've built one of justice. And she deserved this. The final words left my mouth like a blade, cutting through the lingering torment in my chest. I remembered every scornful look Claudia gave me, every mocking laugh at that wine party, every public notice meant to disgrace me. It all piled on. For so long I thought I'd never lift my head again. But now, with Claudia dethroned, a $4 million resort in ruins, and the community rising together, I knew the silence and endurance I had carried all this time finally had an answer. I looked into my daughter's eyes and saw something new: belief. She would grow up remembering that one day, father refused to bow down. She wouldn't think of justice as some unreachable dream, but as something that lives among us, ready to be claimed by those who dare. The wind swept past, carrying with it the earthy tang of mud from the lake, but this time it didn't bother me. That scent felt like proof of change, of a new cycle beginning. The cracks in the lake bed would slowly fill with water again, just as the wounds in this community were beginning to mend through unity. I imagined the old bridge not as something that could return, but as a memory transformed into something else, an invisible bridge connecting those who had once been divided by the rule of the HOA. Back when Claudia held power, everyone kept their heads down, hoping to preserve a sliver of peace through fear. But now, they had seen the strength of truth, and they would never retreat again. I placed a hand on my daughter's shoulder, my voice slow but unwavering. Wherever you go in life, remember this: the most important thing isn't money, skin color, or status. It's your dignity. That's the one thing no one can take from you, unless you let. She nodded, a quiet smile forming on a face still tears. On the walk home, we passed a few neighbors. They stopped, shook my hand, no longer hesitant or distant. An elderly woman with silver hair said soft, "Thank you for doing what we didn't dare." I only nodded. I didn't need praise, because I knew I wasn't a hero. I was just a father who refused to let his daughter grow up in fear and shame. That night, after all the lights in the house had gone out, I remained by the window, staring out at the lake. Moonlight stretched across the cracked earth. I knew that tomorrow, and in the days to come, the lake would slowly come back to life, and with it, Lakeshore Estates would begin to change. No one would be free to manipulate others with absurd rules anymore, and no one would dare humiliate others just to feed an inflated ego. I gently closed the window, feeling lighter than I had in a long time. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months, without dreams of the bridge being destroyed, Claudia's mocking laugh. Instead, I dreamed of my daughter running across a new bridge, not one made of wood, but of something far sturdier: belief. And I knew with certainty that wit was a bridge no one could ever tear down. When everything came to an end, I finally had the chance to look back on the entire journey. It began with a simple wooden bridge, where my daughter and I once found moments of after personal loss. But from the moment Claudia Harrow appeared with the power of the HOA in hand, that bridge became a symbol of confrontation, a boundary between those who believed themselves elite and the ordinary resident. Claudia destroyed the bridge, smeared my name, and turned my family into a target of collective disdain. Each insult, every public notice of disgrace, every mocking laugh at that party added fuel to fire that eventually led me to one bold decision: to open the dam my family owned and exposed. The day the water surged through the steel gates, the luxurious resort across the lake began to crumble. The chaos wasn't caused by a natural disaster, but by one person's blind ambition that turned a shared resource into private gain. As the resort ran dry in the mud, the community witnessed the collapse of the power Claudia once clung to. The evidence I presented didn't just unmask a scheme, it made the residents realize that silence had allowed injustice to endure for far too long. What stays with me is not the moment the resort cracked open or when Claudia bowed her head in front of the press, but when neighbors came to shake my hand, when the old veteran cried because his dignity had been restored, and when my daughter looked at me with unwavering trust. That was the real victory. It was no longer my story alone, but the story of Lakeshore Estates, a community once suppressed and divided by discrimination discrimination and fear, finally learned to stand up and defend itself. Looking back, I understand now that this fight was never about revenge. I may carry the pain of losing the bridge, but if I had stopped there, I'd have been no different from those who bowed to Claudia's fragile sense of it was resistance, risky, imperfect, but necessary, that carved a new path forward. I taught my daughter that justice isn't a luxury, but something every person can reach if they have enough courage, and she learned that no one has the right to strip away her dignity. The greatest lesson from this story is that silence never protects anyone. People like Claudia only appear powerful because they know the community is afraid, because they know others will accept control to avoid trouble. But when one person dares to stand up, it becomes a torch that lights the way for everyone. I watched an entire community transform from downcast eyes to voices, united in removing someone who had abused their power. The second thing I came to realize is that it doesn't always come from a courtroom or the law. Sometimes, it comes from a decisive act, from a choice to face the consequence. I opened the dam not simply to return the pain to Claudia, but to make her understand that every action has a price. The fall of the $4 million resort wasn't just the loss of property, it was greed and arrogance will always lead to ruin. In the end, the story reminded me of personal responsibility. I could have remained silent, continued to live under judgmental stares, let my daughter grow up, believing that shame was something to be accepted, but I couldn't. I chose to stand up, and because of that, my daughter can now look at the world with clear eyes and believe that dignity is something never to be surrendered. That's the greatest legacy I can leave her, far more than any possession. Now, when I walk with my daughter along the lake's edge, I no longer see this place as a symbol of fear, but as a symbol of change. Claudia has lost all power, the HOA has been restructured, and the residents have reclaimed their voice. I whispered to my daughter that while our bridge may be gone, a greater one has been built, a bridge of justice, connecting people who were once divided. And most importantly, Claudia Harrow has fallen, just as she deserved. This story, for me, is not just a personal memory but a message to anyone facing injustice. Don't let silence become a weapon for those who abuse power. Remember, it only takes one person to stand up for an entire community to find its voice again. Justice isn't far away, it lives in the courage within each of us.